Thank you, Ivan, and thanks a lot for ESI. I think it's not only timely, but it's also at a strategic moment to have such a discussion. We have UNGA week. Everyone mentioned the summit yesterday. Today there is an important meeting of the UN Crisis Response Group at the level of the leaders. We are a few weeks away from the Committee on World Food Security on the 10th of October, and also on the eve of COP Sharm el-Sheikh and the Nature COP in Montreal. And thanks, Vivano, to position me just after Emil, because this is clearly music to our ears. And I think the business as usual model is not going to do any tricks. You mentioned the food crisis of 2007-2008 when I was in the agri, and there was a perfect storm. Now it's not a storm, it's a hurricane. And it's a force, the worst force of hurricane. And we can't be firefighters with sprinklers. Because if you are just a firefighter, you will not solve what is going to happen and what's happening. And the risks are big. Okay, we know that the situation on international markets has calmed down. The issue of the Black Sea after August is calming things down, but we are still at higher prices of foodstuffs compared to last year, and the situation is not looking good for certain products for 2023. So for us, what is important, and Kathleen mentioned and all the speakers mentioned, Team Europe for us is critical. All hands on deck. This is not INFA, this is not Agri, this is not EAS, this is all services, and we are organized at services also to respond to what Emil is saying. Because I can't just produce for the sake of producing, and then we go to COP and say, we need to be coherent on the nature and biodiversity and the deforestation and the rights-based approach. In the Commission services, we want to tick lots of boxes. But when you do box ticking, there is a challenge. From a human rights-based approach, from an economic, social, from an inequalities point of view, very few mentioned inequalities. COVID has exposed, and the war and the aggression is amplifying even more, and climate is amplifying inequalities. So the question is, how can we reach those farmers, those indigenous populations, giving them a bit of a share of the cake? And you know, because you are also involved, Vivano, in what we are trying to do on one value chain. And the complexity of food, and this is cocoa, the complexity of food is there is no silver bullet across the food systems. Because some try to explain that this is similar to the vaccine dimension. I always say this is not the vaccine dimension. This is not vaccine. You don't have a Pfizer injection and you solve food. You can solve COVID, but you can't. Because you have to look at cocoa, you have to look at coffee, you have to look at agropastoralism, you have to look at aquatic. All these have very specific issues, very specific menus on how you have to tackle them. And I will give you an example of what we are trying to do on agroecology. And this, I think, is important because we try to be diplomatic, politically correct, but there are vested interests in the system to have the business as usual model. And that is going to be difficult to break the status quo. Because we can't just continue doing as Emil is saying. We fund loads of studies, and when colleagues tell me we fund another study, I tell them, I'm not going to fund more studies. The studies are there, and we fund studies. We finance the Committee on World Food Security. Why do we do it? Because we want to have a bottom-up approach. We can't continue deciding in Brussels or in Geneva or in New York what we want to do. We have to give the empowerment of societies that farmers in cocoa, in coffee, have that part of the value chain. With the living income differential, we're trying to address deforestation, we're trying to address child labor. But this is tough work, because there might be other silver bullets that others are propounding. And again, no one spoke about the geopolitics of food, but there is geopolitics of food. food is not only weaponized, but food is also political. And food is political because there are different models. If I go to Rwanda, and Nicola was there, but if I take the range of countries that we as INPA intervene, I have also to do prioritization. The Global Crisis Response Group has over 80 countries under stress. Can we work in 80 countries in a sprinkler approach? I can't. We try to, but it's going to be impossible. Because the 7.7 billion, you said it's big money. It's not big money, it's peanuts. 7.7 billion to try to solve all this. If you want to try to solve deforestation, if you want to try to empower gender and youth, and be transformative, and work on the national pathways of the UN Food System Summit, and be empowering, engaging, and look into budget deficit, into the financials, because that is the key issue. We work as technicians on the food systems dimension, and you can get the best food technicians from environment, social scientists, anthropologists. But then the big transformative issue is what the IMF and the World Bank are going to do in terms of the shock absorbers on the issue of budget deficits, indebtedness, shocks to the food import bill that Rashad mentioned, because that is going to be a bit the cushion, the shock absorber in terms of what happened in Sri Lanka, or it's what's happening in many countries across the globe in order to avert riots and crises. So that is a bit what we are trying to do with the 600 million. So 100 million in terms of the IMF response on the macroeconomic side, the 150 million on humanitarian, so humanitarian development, peace nexus, these would be the Horn of Africa's and the Sahels of this world, but also our 350 million from the INPA portfolio is to give a clear signal on a production boost. We need, if we want to be transformative, we want to enhance self-sufficiency in Africa, because that is going to be critical. But self-sufficiency not at all costs. And it is the model that Emil is mentioning. It's working with the farm initiative under plant proteins, diversifying the portfolios, integrating it with the Great Green Wall dimension, which I think is very critical if we want to have a landscape approach. But this is not going to do impact necessarily tomorrow. And our politicians and political masters want results yesterday, not tomorrow. Even how we receive requests. We receive requests for in an hour's time. Probably if I look at my mobile, they want a silver bullet in an hour because someone wants it in Unga. We can't solve problems like this. But it's a hard way. And the question is, do political leaders, if I go to Rwanda, to Mr. Kagame, if I go to West Africa, do the political leaders want a model which is transformative, which dismantles silos? Silos not in the sense of green silos, but in the case of cross-cutting approaches, where the Ministry of Finance, it's not only the farmers, the Ministry of Finance are at the core of the decision-taking process. Because everyone speaks about CADE. We know CADE. 20 years track record. How many countries are investing 10% of their public expenditure? Less than 10 out of 50 for African countries. So we can go to EU-Africa summits and we say another declaration, fine. But if you don't put the money where it needs to be, and if you don't agree on the pathway that you validated at New York a year's time, and if you don't track it, if you don't monitor it, if you don't maybe showcase why agroecology works, because there is a lot of skepticism out there, that agroecology is not going to be transformative. And that is, I think, our role also as DG INPA with our colleagues in other services, to show that agroecology is a solid pathway. It is a pathway on a social point of view, on an environmental point of view, on an ecosystem services point of view, that farmers, through carbon sequestration, to soil nets, because you can't just solve the problems. A lot of things have been done, fertilizers, and Yesterday you heard a lot of announcements on fertilizers, but not fertilizers at all costs. Because we have lots of studies, Emil can enumerate them, where you put fertilizers, you kill the soil fertility. And it's a disaster. So soil synthetics, yes, but if it is mapped with the right soil maps. We are not saying no to synthetics at all costs, but we also want more organic fertilizers. We want also working on a typology of inputs which gives a rights-based approach on seeds. No one mentions on seeds, but informal seed systems. That is what we are trying also to support. So these might not be the big shots of initiatives, but we're working on agro-pastoralism. One of the things, and Katri knows this, one of what we are calling now global gateways, who are in the EU jargon. We have lots of terminology these days, but something which I think is very important, which we didn't mention much, is agro-pastoralism. This is not trendy, but if you see what's happening in Africa and Sahel in the Horn, most of the conflict is linked to land, water, rights around agro-pastoralism. And that has to be tackled, as well as the plant proteins, as well as coffee and cocoa and fruit and vegetables and the whole range. There are about 15 value chains where we can't let the other value chains. But this is something, and what we are trying to do, hopefully with member states, is to try to solve whether, like we did on the Rinderpest, we can also work around what is known as the pest epidurumina, with OIE, FAO, AUI in Nairobi, to actually have the eradication of the pest epidurumina, which could be a silver bullet also under agro-pastoralism. So this is something that we will sound and we will meet the member states to tell them, do you want to put funds on the, because this is what I want. I have Gates, I have World Bank, but I need also the member states. Where do we want to put the money? Do we want to put money on agroecology? To do this in Togo, in Benin, in Burkina? This is the specificity that when I go to the council, I want to go not only in the 7.7 billion, but in our portfolio, country by country, with our member states, with farm, with gas, with the Mediterranean dialogues that I will participate in Italy next week, to have this coordination on the ground and see with a country-aligned agenda, because it has to be country-aligned. I can't just impose from what Brussels wants and say this is the model. Maybe the agroecology model is not the model that the countries want. So this is something that I think is critical. The same on fisheries, on illegal fisheries, on de-risking value chains. We are still having major problems to de-risk value chains. This is why we are working with the FAO Investment Center, with IFAD. Part of the big portfolio we have under the 350 million is with IFAD, to also work with public development and access to finance, work on logistics, on infrastructure nodes, because tackling food loss and waste, which is 1/3 of all the production. You have mangoes in Senegal. I used to go to see with Commissioner Cholos in the past, first time in Senegal, you see loads of mangoes. I pay a mango in Brussels, it's like a jewel, and then you see them rotting in the fields. So these are things which I think need to be addressed. Same with R&I. This is the work we do with CRGIR, is aligned on agroecology, and African continental free trade area, because it's good that we speak about saying Africa needs to integrate and say, good, thank you very much, and so what? We need to go into the detail what it means, because intra-regional agriculture trade in Africa is a very low 15%, maybe 20%. If you want to have regional continental dynamics, and you have to emulate the Asian model, I'm not speaking about green revolution here, but an Asian model of integration or a European model, you have to go into the 50-60% range. And you know what's happening in terms of intra-regional dynamics in ECOWAS, in SADC, in Eastern and South. We are far from there. We are accompanying them. But again, this is a tall order. because there is sanitary, phytosanitary, there are customs, borders. Africa also has to dismantle its barriers within itself, amongst itself, because this is going to be the only big transformational approach to have intra-regional trade, and that is really the medium to long-term solution for regional dynamics in the African continent. And we will clearly continue supporting all this. So I can go in the detail country by country. We will do it with the member states. We'll start showcasing what's working, and we will also acknowledge where it's not working. But it's also a question of political alignment with the countries, and clearly the need to empower those who are voiceless. Because if you don't give them a voice, then we'll continue with our business as usual model.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.